More than 20 countries that controlled territory on 6 continents would declare war between 1914 and 1918, making World War I, also known as the Great War, the first truly global conflict. On one side, Britain, France, and Russia formed the Triple Entente, also known as the Allied Powers, or, simply, the Allies. On the other side, Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Italy made up the Triple Alliance, also known as the Central Powers. Those alliances, however, were hardly static, and over the course of the war Italy would change sides, the United States, Japan, and many other nations would join the Allied Powers. The Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria would join the Central Powers, and Russia would withdraw altogether due to revolution back home. By the war's end in 1918, the Allied Powers emerged victorious, but both sides were left reeling from the scale of the violence. New technologies like chemical gas and long-range artillery drove conflict to cruel new heights. 9 million soldiers died while the civilian death toll likely exceeded 10 million. Infectious diseases also ran rampant, fighting leveled infrastructure, and the financial toll of the war was immense, leaving Europe in economic disarray. How did World War I start? The 1914 assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, triggered a series of declarations of war. But many scholars argue that a confluence of factors had been creating the conditions for conflict in Europe for decades prior. As the military historian Liddell Hart wrote, 50 years were spent in the process of making Europe explosive and 5 days were enough to detonate it. This resource explores the factors that led to the outbreak of World War I and the ways in which the conflict reshaped society. Origins of World War I. In order to understand the origins of World War I, let's first go back to the early 1800s. For centuries, a competing patchwork of European empires and kingdoms had waged near constant war with each other over reasons such as land, colonies, religion, resources, and dynastic rivalries. As a result, the borders within the continent shifted frequently. But after a series of military campaigns to defeat the French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, who had conquered most of Europe, representatives from several European powers met in Vienna in 1814 and 1815 to bring the repeating cycle of war to an end. What emerged was a series of agreements and understandings that ushered in an unusual period of relative stability for the continent. The resulting diplomatic system, known as the Concert of Europe, sought to preserve peace by supporting existing dynasties over revolutionary movements. With peace at home, Europe enjoyed a century of immense progress with corresponding influence on the global stage. Technological innovations like the development of machine production, steel, electricity, and modern chemistry enriched the continent. Meanwhile, improvements in shipping, railroads, and weapons allowed countries to project their power farther abroad. As a result, Europe's strongest empires, namely Belgium, Britain, France, the Netherlands, Portugal, and, later, Germany, Italy, and Russia, controlled much of the world throughout the 19th century. However, this period of European peace and prosperity would not last forever. Many historians believe things began to unravel in the mid-1800s with various regional conflicts and wars to unify the countries of Germany and Italy. But, unequivocally, Europe's century of stability had come to a cataclysmic end with World War I. Causes of World War I. 1. The rise of Germany. Following the Napoleonic Wars, Europe experienced a rough balance of power on the continent. In other words, the region's strongest countries typically avoided massive conflicts with each other because they were fairly equal in strength. This meant that the costs of going to war would almost certainly outweigh any expected benefits. Initially, the strength of Austria, Britain, and Russia preserved peace and order. Later, Britain and Prussia, which would become part of Germany in 1871, maintained this balance as the continent's strongest countries. The two nations both had large populations, towering economies, and robust militaries. However, power dynamics shifted yet again in the latter half of the 19th century. Britain, the world's largest empire and the biggest naval and economic power, saw its relative strength begin to fade in the mid to late 1800s. For generations, Britain had enjoyed global primacy through its strong trade ties, unparalleled navy, and sprawling empire, which provided access to natural resources and markets around the world. However, the costs of maintaining such a vast, globe-spanning empire began to mount. Additionally, by the end of the 19th century, rapidly industrializing countries like the United States and Germany began to outcompete Britain, which had formerly held a technological and manufacturing edge on the rest of the world. Germany only emerged as an independent country in 1871 when Prussian leader Otto von Bismarck unified what had previously been 39 independent states made up of a group of people fairly unified in language and culture, though not religion, into a single political unit. This new, united Germany would soon become exceedingly wealthy through industrialization and begin to showcase its power on the global stage through the acquisition of colonies in Africa. Although Bismarck worked to preserve peace on the continent by balancing among the other powers, later leaders would instead choose to focus on asserting German dominance regardless of the consequences. Notably, historians describe Kaiser Wilhelm II as insecure and arrogant, a man whose unbridled ambition to claim Germany's place in the sun ultimately translated into recklessness. For example, he abandoned the reinsurance treaty with Russia in 1890, which led to Russia becoming friendly with France, an old enemy to Germany, and then with Britain. Wilhelm spoke openly and belligerently about his desire for German economic and military supremacy and endeavored to make this vision a reality. In particular, he invested heavily in military spending, hoping to build a navy that could challenge Britain's globally renowned fleet. This rapid militarization ignited an arms race on the continent, which unsettled Europe's balance of power. 2. Nationalism. Nationalism is a powerful force that unites people based on ethnic, linguistic, geographic, or other shared characteristics. In certain contexts, it can serve as a basis of unity, inclusion, and social cohesion for a country. But when taken to extremes, nationalism can fuel violence, division, and global disorder. In the lead-up to World War I, nationalism fueled intense competition in Europe. The continent's most powerful countries frequently tried to best each other through their empires, militaries, and technological innovations. Meanwhile, governments, the new mass print media, and schools and universities reinforced messages of each country's superiority. With memories of the Napoleonic Wars long since faded, countries viewed war as a quick and easy way through which to achieve glory. In fact, some Europeans celebrated the arrival of World War I. Parades and cheering spectators sent off their soldiers to the front lines. Young men rushed to recruiting offices eager not to miss the opportunity to serve. Few imagined that the war would drag on for 4 years in such horrific fashion. Although nationalism unified countries like Britain, France, and Germany, albeit to dangerous extremes, the same force pulled other European empires apart. In particular, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire and Russia struggled to promote a cohesive national identity given their populations' vast internal differences along ethnic and religious lines. In fact, the first shot of World War I, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, came at the fault lines of one of those multi-ethnic empires, with the assassins executing their attack in the name of Slavic nationalism. Three. Alliance networks. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand could have remained a small, localized affair. After all, the attack did not directly affect the continent's greatest forces such as Britain, France, Germany, or even Russia. Rather, it involved two lesser powers, Austria-Hungary and Serbia. However, European leaders had spent years prior to the assassination constructing a network of alliances built on the promise of collective security, or the idea that an attack on one country would be treated as an attack against the entire alliance. In theory, those alliances were intended to serve as a deterrent to conflict. A stronger country would be less inclined to attack a weaker one if the latter had the support of a powerful ally. In reality, the alliance networks had the opposite effect of expanding a local issue into a continent-spanning crisis, for behind Austria-Hungary stood Germany, behind Serbia stood Russia, and behind Russia stood Britain and France. 1 week after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II pledged unconditional support to Austria-Hungary in however it chose to respond to the attack. With this so-called blank check assurance, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on July 28, 1914, and within days France, Germany and Russia announced their own cascading declarations of war. Thus, Europe marched toward war, or, rather as one historian describes the consequences of careless decision-making, the continent found itself sleepwalking its way to World War I. How did World War I change the world? World War I was incredibly destructive. But perhaps most tragic of all, the war to end all wars ultimately did nothing of the sort, as both the conflict and its aftermath sowed the seeds for a second and even deadlier world war just 2 decades later. Although World War I did not curtail future conflict, it nevertheless transformed society across the United States, Europe, the Middle East, and Sub-Saharan Africa. New Age of Warfare. World War I ushered in a new age of lethal military technology, including landmines, flamethrowers, submarines, tanks, and fighter planes. Aerial photography allowed both sides to create sophisticated maps of their opponents' positions. Long-range artillery gave soldiers the ability to shoot at enemies they could not see. And the introduction of weapons of mass destruction, including chemical gas, were an attempt to break through the dug-in stalemates of trench warfare. The scale and severity of such combat led tens of thousands of veterans to experience debilitating psychological trauma then known as shell shock and now more commonly referred to as post-traumatic stress disorder. In addition, although previous wars were largely contained to the battlefield, World War I was a total war, eroding the distinction between civilian and military targets. Germany, for example, used submarines to attack civilian ships and used airships known as zeppelins to bomb cities in Britain. The war also featured mass killings and expulsions of particular ethnic groups such as Armenians from the Ottoman Empire, a practice that many scholars would later term genocide. Plastic surgery. Before World War I, people who experienced disfiguring wounds had limited options to choose from. However, as the number and magnitude of facial disfigurations skyrocketed among soldiers fighting in the First World War, the medical community worked quickly to invent reconstruction procedures. Dr. Harold Gillies is credited with the idea to use patients' own facial tissue to decrease the chance of transplant rejection, leading to rapid innovation in the field of plastic surgery capabilities spanning from successful skin grafts to the first sex reassignment surgeries. Rise and fall of powers. The end of World War I marked a shift in global powers, through the fall of major empires, such as the Ottoman Empire, and the rise of a new global power, the United States. Innovations beyond the battlefield. In addition to new forms of weaponry, many medical practices and common household items have their origins in war. During World War I, doctors began using sodium citrate to stop blood from clotting and performed some of the first successful skin grafts, which paved the way for modern plastic surgery. Additionally, the invention of splints greatly reduced the lethality of certain injuries. Before the war, 4 out of every 5 soldiers with a broken femur died. After the introduction of the splint, 4 out of every 5 survived. The Great War also led to the development of Kotex, one of the first branded sanitary products, used as a cheaper and more absorbent wartime alternative to cotton bandages. The popularization of exercises like Pilates, invented by a captured German bodybuilder to stay fit. And the rise in print cartoons, used both as military propaganda and to help civilians and veterans process the horrors of war. The end of World War I. World War I brought about the collapse of 4 empires, the Austro-Hungarian, German, Ottoman, and Russian. In many cases, the victors of World War I absorbed territory from those former empires. Britain and France carved up land belonging to the Ottoman Empire. Meanwhile, Germany was forced to cede its colonies in Africa and the Pacific as part of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, a peace treaty that set the terms for the end of World War I in 1919. The breakup of these empires also resulted in the creation of new countries in Europe such as Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, in addition to the re-emergence of old ones like Poland. With World War I leaving even Europe's victors badly weakened, the global center of power began shifting across the Atlantic to the United States. Even before the war, the United States had surpassed Britain to become the world's strongest economy. After the war, the United States emerged in an even more powerful position, uniquely situated to shape the new international order. However, the American public was largely uninterested in international leadership at the time, and the country retreated into a period of isolationism.